The Selective Service Act was passed on the 16th of September in 1940, requiring all men between the ages of 18 and 36 to register, and the draft began the following month, with the first getting inducted on the 18th of October. And as soon as he graduated in 1941, Smitty went right into the Army. I was thrilled to death to have a job. I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Quartermaster Corps and sent to a truck company in Fort Benning, Georgia. You know, the Army, in its infinite wisdom, sent me to a truck company because I majored in accounting. Children of the Healer, page 133. After a couple more years sober, Dr. Bob's business was back on its feet, and most of the young doctors would go off to help fight Hitler, and that would leave Dr. Bob with more customers. After the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Smitty was put on a B-24 Liberator guarding convoys in the Atlantic, and he was based in North Africa. And when Smitty came home for Christmas in 1943, he went to Clovis Air Force Base in New Mexico and met Betty, and they were married in October of 1944 and lived in Cleveland for a year. And then they moved to Hobbs, New Mexico. A friend of Smitty's bought a business, but it failed, so Smitty got a job on an oil rig, and then got a better job with an oil company, who asked Smitty to fly their plane, quote, ferrying the company president around on various business and pleasure trips, close quote, while Betty stayed home with their 3 children. When Smitty's mother and Dr. Bob came to see them in New Mexico in 1949, she caught pneumonia on the way home and died at the age of 68. But Anne had been in poor health for some time. Bill himself had said that Ann Smith is the mother of AA, and I've wondered if maybe they might have quit if it hadn't been for my mother's continuing unfailing support. Doc and Bill would get so discouraged. There were big egos and big fights over the writing of the big book. There was a lot of suspicion. Children of the Healer, page 132. Some of the stories for the big book were written in our dining room. The guys would come over and sit at the old dining room table with a yellow tablet and a big chief pencil. They weren't literary people. This thing wasn't easy. Children of the Healer, Ibid. It became obvious to Bill W. that they needed a book, because they were saying the same thing to new people over and over, and it would be much more simple to write it down for them. Dick B. said there were really 79 writers of the big book, and they all struggled against the notion that there was something morally wrong with drinking alcohol because the sting of prohibition was still fresh. Yet without prohibition, AA would have gone down as just another fringe religious group. And compared with the truly wacko church ladies, the general public welcomed AA as a better path than the repression of the abolitionists. Ebby got a job working for the Ford Motor Company in a small town in September of 1936, and when he started drinking again, writing the big book became Bill W.'s prime directive, and Ford would be mentioned in the chapter The Family afterward. Henry Ford once made a wise remark to the effect that experience is the thing of supreme value in life. Alcoholics Anonymous, page 124. Bill W. had almost taken a job at Towns Hospital in September of 1936, but the other AAs said, "Why should we volunteer to do what you get paid for?" And Bill realized that AA could only happen for love and not for money. In February of 1936, Bill had started getting work again and became a director of a car parts company from Indiana. And a couple of the AAs got into business running gasoline service stations that were called gasoline dealers. And their secretary was a German girl named Ruth, and the business was located at 17 William Street in Newark. And Ruth found out pretty quickly that these people were more interested in helping drunks than in pumping gas. They called it oxidizing to get someone into the Oxford groups, and as Dr. Bob drove the family car around to find drunks, they called his car the Ark. And when Frank Buchmann went to the Olympic Games in Berlin in 1936, there were Oxford groups in all the major towns in Germany, and the Nazis had been watching them. Buchmann became friends with some of the leading Nazis, and he told them that England and Canada were seething with communism. And when asked if Hitler was a friend of his, Buchmann said, "Half the lies they tell you about the Irish aren't true." Allington Morning Call, May 1941. When Buchmann had gotten back from the Olympic Games, the New York World Telegram interviewed him, and Alcoholics Anonymous would write, "On the 25th of August in 1936, the New York World Telegram published an article about Buchmann, charging that he was pro-Nazi. The newspaper quoted Buchmann as saying, 'I thank heaven for a man like Adolf Hitler who built a frontline defense against the Antichrist of communism. Think what it would mean to the world if Hitler surrendered to God. Through such a man, God could control a nation and solve every problem. Human problems aren't economic, they're moral, and they can't be solved by immoral measures.' While most discussions of the incident, even by Buchmann's critics, have since vindicated him, the article brought the group into public controversy. At the same time, a subtle change took place in both the message and the function of the Oxford group. It moved from small, intimate groups to large gatherings. In 1938, after Oxford University requested that the group, because of the controversy, no longer use its name, it took the name Moral Rearmament, abbreviated to MRA. Increasingly, it worked with national and world assemblies. A number of the early followers withdrew from the movement, dissatisfied with the shift from individual emphasis to mass methods. Pass it on, page 170 to 71. After that, the Oxford groups grew too large, and they also started concentrating on nations instead of individuals. And Buchmann said, "I'm all for the drunks being changed, but we also have drunken nations on our hands." Pass it on, page 131. Buchmann had served America in the Great War, looking after German POWs, and as everyone was getting ready for Hitler's war, Buchmann was talking about, quote, "guidance or guns," close quote, and he was saying that the Munich Pact was the result of divine intervention. And in 1938, Oxford University told Frank Buchmann to quit using their name. Hitler's friends were using the Oxford groups to try to meet rich and famous people that might help the Nazi movement advance. And at Christmas of 1939, Dr. Bob took a vote on moving out of the Oxford group movement. And at his first meeting after formally splitting with the Oxforders, there were 74 people meeting at Dr. Bob's house. A story emerged that some Oxford groupers came to Dr. Bob's first AA meeting and tried to break it up, threatening physical violence, but there is no record of what happened at the first meeting except for a grapevine account years later, noting that it was led by Dr. Bob, who, quote, "put his foot on the rung of a dining room chair, identified himself as an alcoholic, and began reading the Sermon on the Mount," close quote, Dr. Bob, and the Good Old Timers, page 218. Bill W. and Lois had already left the Oxford groups in 1937, but Dr. Bob and his friends had continued to attend until 1939, and the idea of writing the big book had won approval in Akron by only one vote. Bill had started to write the big book in May of 1938, and the first 2 chapters were done by June with the working title 100 Men by Alcoholics Anonymous. To get a book published, Bill W. began trying to raise money, and Charles Towne lent them 1/3 of the money needed to publish the book, Capitalism. And a printer donated the first run, Christian Kindness, and Dr. Bob borrowed $1,200 in 1939 from his mother. And Bill asked the Guggenheim Foundation for a grant, but they told him that they only gave money to support the arts. A Mr. X-Man at Harper's offered to publish it, but Bill W. thought that might not be a good idea because the AAs would lose control of it, and so they were in agreement that they would have to publish it themselves instead. Bill W. came up with the idea of selling shares of stock, and he certainly knew how, and Bill came up with the name Works Publishing to put on the stock shares, and the first printing of the book would be in the spring of 1939. One small group wanted to call the book Coming Back, and it had been written when they were all under 5 years sober, and the original was sold for $3.50 and was printed on very thick paper that was the cheapest kind, making it a big fat book, so they called it the Big Book. Dr. Strong had gotten Bill W. linked up with Rockefeller in November of 1937, and Rockefeller had been a prohibition champion. Rockefeller had been a prohibition champion, and his son John D. Rockefeller Jr. gave the AAs $1,000 and bought 400 copies of the book to pass around to his rich friends, who donated another 2,000, and that would be repeated for several years. John Rockefeller Jr. had been born in Cleveland, and he gave Dr. Bob $3,000 to pay off his mortgage and granted $30 per week to Bill W. and Dr. Bob to make it possible for them to continue their work. Dr. Charles Towns had loaned them $4,000 in 1938 to get the book written, and for that he received 4,000 shares, and Towns would loan them another $2,500 later. Sometimes Ruth Hawk was paid in Works publishing stock when money got tight, and then the guy who put his name on the stock certificates as president got drunk after trying to become over-friendly with Ruth, and she had told him to take a shower. And he never really got sober after that. The Alcoholic Foundation was born in May of 1938, and 90 days later, on the 11th of August, they established a board of trustees with 5 members, 3 of them non-alcoholics. And the following year they expanded the board of trustees to 7. Bill W. served on an advisory committee with 8 members that had an alcoholic majority, and Bill suggested that every AA member pitch in $1 a year towards office expenses. And by Christmas it was discovered that there were 8,000 members, and Bill called 1941, quote, the most exciting year in our history. Close quote. Alcoholics Anonymous comes of age. A brief history of AA, New York, Alcoholics Anonymous, World Services, Inc., 1957-1985, page 192. People got fired up at Dr. Bob and Bill W. for getting royalties on the Big Book and for accepting their $30 a week, so people started talking behind their backs. And soon there were rumors that they were making tens of thousands of dollars from book sales, so they called in a professional to go over the books and showed the records to the membership, who were easily satisfied and pleased now that they were sober. The first mail-order group began in Little Rock, Arkansas, and as a result, the AA group spread to Green Bay and to Detroit, and then to Canada, and to Richmond, Virginia, and to Long Beach, California. And when the Houston Press published an AA story, the Houston groups grew and spread to Austin and to Tampa and to Los Angeles. As local newspapers printed articles about AA, the groups moved into the Deep South and to Hawaii and to Australia and Norway and South Africa and Alaska and Mexico and South America and over to England and to Holland and to France. And Alcoholics Anonymous would write that they went then to Japan and even Greenland and Iceland. The story of Captain Jack in a standard oil tanker spreading AA as he sailed. In such happy reminiscences, we at St. Louis reviewed AA's crossing of the barriers of distance, race, creed, and tongue, and saw our fellowship reaching to the 4 corners of the earth. AA Comes of Age, page 26. The Big Book had first come out in April of 1939, and it would get to Los Angeles in the fall, carried by a woman named Kay. And on the 25th of April, the AAs did a radio show, and the day after that, Bill W. and Lois were homeless when the mortgage company assumed the house that Lois's family had lived in for 50 years. For the next 2 years, Lois and Bill W. would live with AA friends, staying here and there for a while. And it had taken a year to write the Big Book, and Ruth had been typing it, although sometimes he had just dictated it to her. In early 1940, the AAs opened their first clubhouse at 334.5 West 24th Street in a building that had once been a stable and had then become the Artists and Illustrators Club. And Bill W. and Lois moved into one of the upstairs rooms on the 4th of November, and they would live there for 5 months. Whatever hour Bill wandered in, there was the feeling of a meeting. Pass it on, page 239. The book was being reviewed in many newspapers and magazine journals and church bulletins, and they'd started selling a few dozen big books every week. And the New York Times had given a book review in June of 1939. And Dr. Bob wrote an article for Faith magazine in August of 1939, and he received a reply from 12 doctors, and 2 of them wanted to buy a copy of the book. An article in Liberty magazine called Alcoholics and God came out on the 30th of September in 1939, and the Journal of the American Medical Association wrote on the 7th of October in 1939 in the book notices, "The book under review is a curious combination of organizing propaganda and religious exhortation. It is in no sense a scientific book, although it is introduced by a letter from a physician who claims to know some of the anonymous contributors who have been quote-unquote cured of addiction to alcohol, and have joined together in an organization which would save other addicts by a kind of religious conversion. The book contains instructions on how to intrigue the alcoholic addict into the acceptance of divine guidance in place of alcohol, in terms strongly reminiscent of Dale Carnegie and the adherents of the Buchmann Oxford movement. The one valid thing in the book is the recognition of the seriousness of addiction to alcohol. Other than this, the book has no scientific merit or interest." JAMA, Volume 113, Number 16. An article in the Cleveland Plain Dealer was published as a 5-part series in October of 1939, and it was based on a writer having been snuck into the meetings while pretending to be an alcoholic, and within a year of the Cleveland Plain Dealer series, there would be 30 groups and several hundred members in Cleveland. From there, someone from one of the Cleveland groups had gone to Houston and written the articles for the Houston Press, and that's how Texas had gotten AA, and from there it went to Miami. The following spring, on the 24th of February in 1941, Jack Alexander wrote an article about AA for the Saturday Evening Post that came out on the 1st of March, and that story brought in 6,000 letters, and the Saturday Evening Post article had been titled, "Alcoholics Anonymous freed slaves of drink, now they free others." The Cleveland group voted out the undercover guy who wrote the article, so he just went and started another group. And his trick was to put the newcomers to work right away, such as the Wagon Club that would collect old furniture for reconditioning, and they would get the new people to fix it up and then sell it. The Dr. Bob book said that this Cleveland group was responsible for starting the tradition. All you need to start a new group in AA is a resentment and a coffee pot. Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, page 166. They met in Dr. Bob's house for a while, but it became too crowded, and so they went and rented space at the King's School, and that was the first time they had to take up collections to pay the rent. When AA began, there'd been no such thing as videotape, so they'd told their personal stories as a means of staying sober. And if the description of their drinking days fell on deaf ears, they would at least be helping themselves in remembering. At the beginning of the meetings, they would read from the book of James, and they would read the Sermon on the Mount, and they would read from the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians, and they also read from the upper room. The meetings at Dr. Bob's house were almost called the James Club, because they read from that book so often, and after Ann and Bob read aloud from the Bible, they would share spiritual experiences, and they did not tolerate treating the meetings as confessionals, but insisted on talks about, quote, experience, strength, and hope, close quote, and anyone describing immoral acts or boasting about bad behavior was seen as not helpful and were told politely to change the subject. They would not even talk about their drinking very much, but saved those stories for newcomers or hospital interviews. And the early AAs did not want to make the same mistake as the teetotalers, who had given speeches about their drunken sprees in public to entertain people, who wanted to laugh at the alcoholics willing to tell their secrets in public. "You would be surprised how little talk there was of drinking experience even among ourselves," Wally said. "That was usually kept for the interviews with new prospects in the hospital. We were more interested in our everyday life than we were in reminiscing about drinking. Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, page 141. One story had it that when Dr. Bob was guest speaker at an out-of-town meeting, he got up and said that the world's finest talks had been short ones. For example, both the Sermon on the Mount and the Gettysburg Address had been given in less than 5 minutes. With this point in mind, he said, I also propose to give a short talk. In fact, I just did. He sat down. Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, page 224. He was a very calm speaker, and he sounded grateful, said Ed B., an Akron old-timer. Sometimes he would point his finger or spread his arms, but he didn't gesture much, and he always wore a suit and a tie to meetings. When he came to an AA meeting, he was just another alcoholic. He wasn't a doctor or anything. In Dr. Bob's comments, he would always pick some good point the speaker had made, according to Ed. It was more or less to encourage him. He never mentioned much about his own drinking. Ibid. Speakers were not always chosen in advance, according to Norman Y. He recalled Dr. Bob's telling one fellow, George, it's your turn this week. But I didn't prepare anything, the man replied. You didn't prepare to get drunk either, Dr. Bob said. Get up and talk. Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, page 223. People were allowed to come to the meetings drunk if they behaved themselves, since the drunk was doing them all a favor, either showing what would happen if they picked up a drink, or if they got sober it was proof that the program worked. They didn't have chairpersons or secretaries, but a speaker would start with a short reading and a 5-minute talk, and then the members would make comments, and there was no laughing or clapping because they were there on serious business. They didn't like people making drinking sound sensational, and they did not talk about their drinking days because they knew each other well enough to know the details already, and instead they talked about how it was that they were staying sober. The AAs always dressed up to go to meetings, and Dr. Bob said that nobody should ever talk more than 15 minutes or they would begin to repeat themselves. There was a guy named Norman who was blind from drinking bootleg alcohol. And at his first AA meeting, they told him that he didn't really want to be sober. He just wanted to come around and beg for money. But a voice in his head told him to go, and to go regularly, and not to take anything material from these people, not even from doing service work for them. And a year later, he got a job helping other blind people, and he put 10% of his salary into an account to pay for his AA expenses. And after 5 years, his wife and family came back. Because the word Catholic meant universal, while Orthodox meant correct, Dr. Bob was Catholic while Bill was Orthodox, and by October of 1940, 25% of the AAs were Roman Catholics. Somebody showed up who couldn't afford to stay in the hospital, and they let the person come to the meetings anyway. But first he said they, quote, made me go to the home of one of the newer members every night for 3 months, and they had 9 or 10 people talking to me. Then I had to read the big book before I went to my first meeting. Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, page 169. Cleveland did better than Akron, so people thought that AA had started in Cleveland, and from Akron it had spread to Chicago, and from Chicago to Milwaukee and to Minneapolis. And sober alcoholics would come to Akron and hang around until they found out everything they could from the originals, and then go back to wherever they came from to carry the message they had learned in Akron. The idea of an international convention came out of Houston, and the first international convention was held in Cleveland, Ohio, in July of 1950, and there were 3,000 people in attendance. Smitty and Betty went to the first AA International in 1950, and the 12 traditions were approved after having been circulated around as many groups as could be found. And then Smitty bought a little oil field in Texas and became a small producer. And then he became the mayor of his town, and Smitty and Betty would go to meetings where people invited them, and they would say how wonderful it was that these people were sober. We were not very interested in AA because we wanted to do some drinking and partying. We knew about alcoholism, but we didn't really know alcoholism. Imagine 2 people who had the education we had on alcoholism, with both of our parents in a recovery program and both of them successful, and not recognize it in our own home. That was us. Because, you see, we were different. We were absolutely different. It would never happen to us. Children of the Healer, page 101. Even though she helped type it up, Suzanne Smith said she wouldn't read the big book until 1975. On May 11, 1950, about 3 months before the Cleveland Convention, Bill and Lois went to Europe, specifically to visit AA in Europe. A letter Bill wrote to Dr. Bob from Dublin read, in part, "We have been gone not quite 7 weeks now and have visited 4 cities in Norway, 3 in Sweden, 1 in Denmark, 2 in Holland, as well as Paris, London, and now Dublin, Ireland. Pass it on." Page 337. The AAs at Dublin were on a most congenial basis with the North Irelanders at Belfast. The AAs at Dublin were on a most congenial basis with the North Irelanders at Belfast, despite an occasional burst of rock-throwing among their compatriots in the streets. AA Comes of Age, page 27. In April of 1951, the first General Service Conference convened in New York with the theme, "Not to govern, but to serve." They were proving as never before that AA's tradition, too, was correct. Our group conscience could safely act as the sole authority and sure guide for Alcoholics Anonymous. As the delegates returned home, they carried this deep conviction with them. For example, at its very first session, the conference had suggested that the Alcoholic Foundation ought to be renamed the General Service Board of Alcoholics Anonymous. To their minds, the word foundation had stood for charity, paternalism, and maybe big money. What had been good for our infancy would be no good for our future. Pass it on, page 349. Bill W. knew that AA was about self-government, and people were eager to know the AA rules, and instead of repeating the same advice over and over, Bill W. wrote it all down on paper, and what he had first called the 12 points became the 12 traditions, and they were published by the GSB in the Grapevine magazine. The first issue of the Grapevine was 8 pages long and had been published in June of 1944, and the Grapevine had been started for Hitler's war so AA soldiers could stay sober overseas. The AA magazine was started by, quote, 6 ink-stained wretches, close quote, specifically to reach the people in the military, and Bill W. would write more than 100 articles for them. 2 months after the Grapevine landed on the Normandy beaches, Hitler apparently began taking cocaine twice a day in August of 1944 on his doctor's recommendation, and Hitler said that it made him think more clearly, and within a year he would be dead. There were 2 kinds of people to watch in AA, those who made it and those who didn't, and the Oxford groups became the Moral Rearmament Society, and Buchmann would be nominated for the Nobel Prize by his Scandinavian friends in 1951 and in 1952. Reinhold Niebuhr had come out with a denunciation of Buchmann in 1936 in the October 7th edition of the Christian Century, so the man who wrote the precursor to the Serenity Prayer had disliked Buchmann. Bill W. thought that not being anonymous was what Hitler's war was about. And instead of the sacrifice and humility of staying anonymous, Bill thought that Hitler's goal was, quote, the disastrous pursuit of personal power and prestige, close quote, and the improper seeking of, quote, public honors. Along these lines, Heidegger wrote, the concealing of the concealed being as a whole holds sway in that disclosure of specific beings which, as forgottenness of concealment, becomes errancy. On the Essence of Truth, Section 7. Bill W. turned down an honorary degree from Yale, but told them he would accept it in the name of AA, but not in his own name, and they said the AA who stayed too anonymous was breaking the traditions as well. As Bill had once predicted, a single copy of the Big Book or a single enthusiastic member was all that was really required to start a group. In November 1941, on the eve of Pearl Harbor, AA had 200 groups and a membership of 6,000, most of whom had never seen Bill. He would spend most of the next 3 years, 1941 to 1944, on the road, out in the groups, getting to know the members, making himself available to the individuals, talking, listening, counseling, sharing, and above all, giving of himself to nurture this being, this embodiment of his compelling vision. Pass it on, page 267. In February of 1937, there had been 12 AA members in Akron. And by November, they had increased to 40 members. And in that fall of 1937, Bill W. and Dr. Bob realized that they had started a chain reaction. In June of 1941, the Serenity Prayer had shown up in an obituary in the newspaper, and the members adopted it as particularly applicable to drunks, and by 1944 there were 360 AA groups with a membership of over 10,000 sober souls. Bill and Lois had gone on a cross-country trip across America by railroad on the 24th of October in 1943, and they rode the train from New York to Chicago to Denver to Arizona to L.A., and then up to San Francisco and Portland and Seattle, and then back down to San Diego, and at each stop they would be met at the station by AAs, and they would go to speak at their groups, which included meetings at San Quentin and Folsom Prison. On the way home, they went back through L.A., and then on to Tucson and to Houston and to New Orleans, then back to Houston and to Dallas, and then to Little Rock and Oklahoma City, and once more back to Little Rock before returning home to New York on the 22nd of January in 1944. Dr. Bob's cancer would be discovered in 1948, and he would be dead 2 years later, and 3 different doctors had failed to diagnose his prostate cancer, which just so happens to be the keystone philosophy of Alcoholics Anonymous, in that we cannot see our own disease except as reflected in the members of the group. For the last 2 years of his life, Dr. Bob went around drinking his morphine from a little bottle they used to let people carry home with them. And when Dr. Bob died, he'd been sober for 15 years, and for 5 of those years he'd been sick. Dr. Bob gave his last speech in July of 1950 at the first International Convention in Cleveland, and Dr. Bob said that AA boils down to 2 things, love and service. And then he stopped going to meetings at King's School and stayed home so Emma could give him morphine shots. Emma finally got Dr. Bob to watch television, and he liked it a lot, especially the college wrestling, and Dr. Bob smoked cigarettes to the very end. Dr. Bob said that you had to sponsor yourself every now and then. Dr. Bob said that you had to sponsor yourself every now and then, and after he died, Bill W. began writing the 12 by 12, and it would be published in 1953, and quickly sold 50,000 copies. When the 12 traditions were adopted at the convention in 1950, Bill W. had been warning that groups could quickly become, quote, a drinker's club, a hospital, a bank, or a nursery. Pass it on, page 225, and by 1951, there were 112,000 members in over 4,000 groups, and all delegates to the next convention were seated by 1952. At the Second International Convention held in St. Louis in July of 1955, there were over 130,000 members belonging to 6,000 groups, and Suzanne said they had a social hour before dinner where there was a table of real drinks at one end and soft drinks on the other. Bill W. had suffered from burdensome depression for 2 years before and after Hitler's war, so he had cut his sugar consumption by 2/3, and it helped a little. And the doctor gave him thyroid hormone, and it cheered him up. And Bill also got B12 shots and other hormone shots, and he got sold on niacin for a while. But he wouldn't be relieved of the depression until he designed a service structure for AA that allowed him to step aside. Bill's idea of putting AA into the hands of a conference had always been to protect the sovereignty of the individual drunk, lest any self-deluded authority make the mistake of thinking they had any power over the individual alcoholic's personal relationship with God as he reveals himself. After 1955, the year he declared AA of age, pronounced the service structure complete, and turned the fellowship over to its members, he was free of depression. Pass it on, page 303. The year AA came of age in 1955, Dora Goldstein turned mice into alcoholics at Stanford University by pumping alcohol fumes into their boxes, and they became addicted in 4 days and had convulsions when the alcohol was stopped, and she showed that their cells had adapted to the presence of alcohol, and so the AMA recognized alcoholism as a disease that year in 1955, although it was considered more as an illness rather than a disease because medical insurance billing had not yet gotten in the way of the right to privacy between a doctor and his patient. Al-Anon started in 1951 and Alateen in 1957, and Bill wrote the chapter to wives, even though many thought it had been Lois, and the GSB in Britain was born that year in 1957, when there were 7,000 groups worldwide hosting 200,000 members. These people were not strangers to me at all. It seems as if I had known and trusted and loved them all my life. I had felt that way about my AA group at home, but now I felt the same way about every AA and all of AA. I can't tell you what this meant. To me it was big. This was real brotherhood. These were my people, my kin and my kind. I belonged to them and they belonged to me. Every barrier, every thought of race, creed, or nationality dropped out of my mind. This tremendous thing happened to me in only a few hours. AA Comes of Age, page 42. The Berlin Wall went up in the summer of 1961, and the 12 concepts were adopted in 1962, and the deep state killed Kennedy in 1963 for letting pot-smoking women swim naked in the White House pool. That year, the song I Want to Hold Your Hand sold 13 million copies, and John Lennon would be shot to death 17 years later. The 30th Anniversary International AA Convention was held in Toronto, Canada in 1965, and they voted to accept the Responsibility Declaration, and by 1967, 1/5 of AAs were meeting overseas. The Declaration of Responsibility was, I am responsible. When anyone anywhere reaches out for help, I want the hand of AA always to be there, and for that, I am responsible. The first World Services meeting took place in 1969 on the 9th to the 11th of October in New York City, and the 35th Anniversary Convention was in Miami Beach in 1970. And that was Bill W.'s last appearance, and at that convention they approved the Declaration of Unity. Bill W. died on the 24th of January in 1971, and a memorial service was held for him on Valentine's Day on the 14th of February, and 1 million big books had been sold by 1973. One AA said of Bill W., Bill is a man of enormous capacity of will. People think they understand what will is, but they don't very well, and people vary in their endowment of will. They think it's puckering yourself up mentally or something, but it isn't. Will and intelligence come right off the spirit. Pass it on, page 302. He was authentic, and he was sincere. But you know, there are sincere fools in the world. The field is crowded. This guy was right on balance on the spiritual stuff. He was the first crack in my armor. Authenticity was a big part of it. I saw he was sane and was for real. Pass it on, page 271. Bill W. had written, The spiritual substance of anonymity is sacrifice. Because AA's 12 traditions repeatedly ask us to give up personal desires for the common good, we realize that the sacrificial spirit, well symbolized by anonymity, is the foundation of them all. It is AA's proved willingness to make these sacrifices that gives people their high confidence in our future. Pass it on, page 308. Bill had started the first paragraph of the 5th chapter of AA Comes of Age, a chapter that was entitled Religion Looks at Alcoholics Anonymous with, The Society of Alcoholics Anonymous is spiritually as well as morally centered. Nearly every AA member comes to believe in and depend upon a higher power which most of us call God. In AA, practically no full recovery from alcoholism has been possible without this all-important faith. God as we understand him is the foundation upon which our fellowship rests. A Comes of Age, page 253. The original language in the requirement for membership asked for an honest desire to stop drinking, but they thought the word honest smacked too much of religion, although they kept using the word purity even longer. And then the Catholics asked for a second look at, quote, found heaven right here on earth, close quote, and changed it to finding utopia right here on earth. Many of the first stories were rejected for talking too much about God. And Bill's original version had been, we prayed to whatever God we thought there was for power to practice these precepts. Pass it on. Page 197. Members were taught to seek faith and also to seek experience through works. And instead of asking God to please remove this fear, they were taught to pray, thank you for courage, strength, and direction. Slogans abounded, having been carried along from the Oxforders, among which were such gems as, love doesn't need to think, anger does. Antabuse had come on the market in 1949, and on the 29th of August in 1956, Bill had taken LSD at the LAVA, and he did it several times over the next 3 years, and then Bill W. had gone back to buying and selling stock on Wall Street. In April of 1966, the General Service Board changed from having an 8-to-7 ratio of non-alcoholics to alcoholics, and the alcoholics won their two-thirds majority, and before Bill W. died at the age of 75 in January of 1971, alcoholism was seen as not merely a search for a relationship with God, but also a quest for finding the true brotherhood of man. Many people had lost faith in God as the result of the Great War, but that didn't hold a candle to the disillusion felt by so very many after Hitler's war, and the CIA was born in 1945 to stop communism right where Hitler's crusade had left off. The first intelligence agency had been the COI, the Office of the Coordinator of Information, but after a year of working during Hitler's war, they had voluntarily disbanded because they considered that their job was done, and they declined to spend any more of Uncle Sam's money. Jewish people who had left their fate in God's hands had ended up in the gas chambers, and when the State of Israel was founded after their first constitution was written on a roll of toilet paper, the State of Israel was able to put Adolf Eichmann on trial in Jerusalem in 1961. When Israel had become a state on the 14th of May in 1948, half of all Jewish people left in the world wondered if it was such a good idea, although it was no coincidence that gold melts at 1948 degrees Fahrenheit. Many Jews who had escaped Hitler came to America, where they were free to engage in an extensive and relentless propaganda backlash about the Holocausts that Christians would come to see as the Great Deception, or the falling away that Jesus had warned about. Admiral Canaris had written that, quote, the corrosive poison of the Jewish attitude, close quote, was not just genetic, but came from their denial about Jesus having come to save us from our sins, and that ongoing denial was not just a matter of morality or morale or motivation, but one of loyalty to the Christian world itself. Jews participating in the backlash after the Holocaust bent themselves to prove to the sorry world that they weren't guilty of killing the Messiah if he wasn't really the Messiah. Stephen Katz wrote that Israel meant one who wrestles with God, and Katz said that in the Holocaust, 40% of all Jews had been killed, including 65% of European Jews, while in Lithuania and Poland, nearly 90% were gone, and the surviving Jews in the world were mostly British and American. The Holocaust in Historical Context by Stephen T. Katz, Volume 1, The Holocaust and Mass Death Before the Modern Age, New York, Oxford University Press, 1994. A book called Facts About Germany by Professor Helmut Arndt said that over 1,200,000 German soldiers remained missing after the war, and that over 3 million German civilians were still refugees in 1964. And Professor Arndt said that since 1945, 1,006 million cubic feet of rubble had been cleared away, allowing Germany to construct new modern architectural wonders. Paris had not been so lucky, but remained clogged with its endless ancient crumbling buildings and its unfortunately inadequate infrastructure. There had been 1,240 Jews in Heidelberg in 1935, and 33 of them would return after the war. And while there had been 600,000 Jews in Germany before the war, and 125,000 of them were still alive at Hitler's death, more than 90,000 of them left Germany after the Nazis were defeated, and that left 30,000 Jews in Germany out of the original 600,000. Professor Arndt said, "The proportion of German Nobel Prize winners in the field of science, which was as high as 40% in the decade 1911 to 1920, fell to 6% between 1951 and 1960. In the same period, the proportion of Nobel Prize winners in this field from the United States rose from 4% to 49%. Facts about Germany by Professor Helmut Arndt, May's Foreign Pocketbooks, Munich, Volk und Heimat, 1964, page 326. The Jews who didn't believe in God after the Holocaust buckled down to playing God by taking upon themselves the role of deciding in the post-war world what was good and bad, right and wrong, and especially what was worthy of punishment, beginning with criticism of Jews or Jewishness that they now declared to be a criminal act, and that offense was expanded to include any exploration of how the Holocaust had happened at all, which resulted in the creation of a huge mysterious black hole that ate away at people's minds until Donald Trump became the president of America and people finally understood exactly how and why the Holocaust had happened in the first place. Jews in Germany had owned most of the news media and the schools and the hospitals, and they'd been working in government offices where they were pushing the idea, held by many Jews, that the Messiah would not return until Jews were in charge of the world to welcome him and to usher in his messianic government. But more importantly, they believed that the Messiah would not show up until Jews had set up a government all ready for him to step into, that he might take his rightful place as their leader. The running the world thing was basically communism, and that's why the Holocaust had happened, and everyone breathed an enormous sigh of relief in knowing, or Befindlichkeit, of the cause of Holocaust carnage, because if the reason for all the death and destruction remained a mystery and a baffling unknown, then it could happen again, and that must never ever happen again, because Jesus taught that every child of God was worthy of the opportunity to find redemption if they had the will. Most of all in Germany during the Roaring '20s, Jews had been seen pushing transvesticism and abortion and extreme liberalism that didn't just smack of perversion, but went much farther into realms that good Christians could not fail but see as devil worship itself. And so it had been easy for Germans to see the Jew as an other, and to wish with their entire soul that they could purge the blessed fatherland of that corrosive poison. And so it had begun, slowly at first, but had quickly gained an almost unstoppable momentum. As with all human endeavors that moved against the law of the principle of identity, the Nazi economy bore at its heart the seeds of its own destruction, since the workers needed to fuel the Nazi war machine were the same people who were the object of their persecutions. Speer wanted to build new edifices in Berlin that would celebrate the victory of the Nazi Party over the old encrusted impotence of a Germany brought to its knees by the Versailles Treaty. And Speer's building anew required that first the slums be cleared, and so they had been, quickly and efficiently, setting a precedent that expanded year by year as Germanic nature took its course in following the master plan. Speer put an eagle at the top of the main hall in Germania, rather than the swastika, because by then the problem would have been solved. In America after Hitler's war, the concept of separation of church and state was weaponized to muzzle Christians. And Elvis was denied the right to sing gospel because Jews blamed Protestants and Catholics for what Hitler had done to them. Because America was predominantly a Christian nation, Jews began smuggling in foreigners to flood the voter rolls with illegals who did not believe their illegally cast votes were actually secret. And this smuggling program was funded by taxpayer dollars and conducted by Jews, believing their Talmud commanded them to, quote, accommodate strangers. To cover their evil scheme to put an end to Christianity, Jews in America had the citizenship question removed from the census form in 1950, and because they did not take the New Testament seriously, Jews equated an abhorrence of Islam to the persecution of Jews by Hitler, and they likened illegal immigration breaking into America with Jews fleeing Hitler's Germany. The devil's best trick has always been telling lies, and after Hitler's war, Jews told Germany that they must accept Islamist invaders in what was left of Germany, and no one dared to oppose that idea, which said a lot about what an enormous military defeat can do to the human spirit. Heidegger had promised that in the danger lies the rescue. And Walid Shuibat proved that in his remarkable ministry, turning from a Muslim terrorist into a convert to Christianity, while the U.S. Supreme Court in 1963 had said that public schools may no longer require recitation of Bible verses, and before long that would become a complete ban. It was not until the Americans withdrew their support for the government in 1962 in the face of a Cold War confrontation with Russia over their Laotian policies that right-wing government members seriously started to enter the drug trade. Anslinger was now out of the way. Opium History, page 267. The Paris Peace Accords were signed on the 27th of January in 1973 that ended the Vietnam War, and the Democrats in Congress refused to abide by the accords that required supporting the South Vietnamese with the ability to defend themselves against the predictable communist takeover, and the large majority of the South Vietnamese had been Catholics. Thereafter, godless social justice warriors introduced the idea that alcoholics were hopeless crazy people, and that crazy people needed alcohol and drugs to cope with being insane, and the golem of the enormous mental health industry thrust expensive psychiatric drugs upon alcoholics. Those pharmaceuticals were paid for by the state, and drunks were offered a steady paycheck from the government for participation in this scheme to cripple America, even though the Big Book said that for alcoholics, quote, little charity in the ordinary sense of the word is needed or wanted. Alcoholics Anonymous, page 98. The U.S. Supreme Court decided that being court-ordered to AA was illegal because the meetings were a church. And in 1973, fetal alcohol syndrome was shown by Dr. Christy Uleland in Seattle to be the cause of permanent birth defects, and more defective babies were being born every year having FAS than all the damage that had been done by thalidomide. That same year, Roe v. Wade decided that the state should not interfere with a person's right to abortion because the fetus could not be considered a separate person without being able to survive outside the mother's body. And the following year, in 1974, the psychiatric community agreed to free homosexuality from being called a disease. So while the Supreme Court had decided Roe v. Wade to free women from bearing unwanted children, in 1974, homosexuality became a sin instead of a medical condition, and pregnancy became a medical condition rather than being a sin. The psychiatric community set out in search of a genetic link to alcoholism. With the same fervor the Nazi scientists had tried to prove that Jews were genetically lazy, and in failing to find an alcoholism gene, the industry settled for mere family history, just as the Nazis had done. There had been two kinds of people in 1935, those who followed the Jewish Freud and those who followed the Christian Jung. while the followers of Carl Jung saw value, meaning, and reality in religious faith. The great majority of psychiatrists in that day did not. They mostly held to Sigmund Freud's view that religion was a comforting fantasy of man's immaturity, that when he grew up in the light of modern knowledge, he would no longer need such support. AA Comes of Age, page 3. Carl Jung had come up with the idea of synchronicity, and an example of Jung's writing from 1956 said, "We permit ourselves the question, which countries have the biggest communist parties? America, which, o quae mutatio rerum, forms the real political backbone of Western Europe, seems to be immune because of the outspoken counterposition she has adopted, but in point of fact she is perhaps more vulnerable than Europe, since her educational system is the most influenced by the scientific Weltanschauung with its statistical truths, and her mixed population finds it difficult to strike roots in a soil that is practically without history. The historical and humanistic type of education, so sorely needed in such circumstances, leads, on the contrary, a Cinderella existence. To be sure, we all say that this is the century of the common man, that he is the lord of the earth, the air, and the water, and that on his decision hangs the historical fate of the nations. This proud picture of human grandeur is unfortunately an illusion, and is counterbalanced by a reality that is very different. The essential Jung, selected and introduced by Anthony Storr, New York, MJF Books, Princeton University Press, 1983, page 367-9. The Jewish Bible was called the Torah. The Jewish Bible was called the Torah, and Jewish poetry was cyclical and repetitive, as shown clearly in Isaiah 46:10. I am God, and there is none like me. At the beginning I announce the end, proclaim in advance things not yet done, and I say that my plan will hold. I will do everything I please to do. The foundation of the Torah, and thus Christianity, rested on the story that God brought us out of bondage in Egypt. And at the end, as at the beginning, what remained at the center of all God's law was that we were once slaves in Egypt. All the Jewish festivals and feast days were about God setting us free from Egypt, and the rest of the Bible was not about God, but about God's problem with people.